started. I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 6 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is continuing its study of greenhouse gas emissions cap for the oil and gas sector. Today is our second day of 8 meetings with witnesses for this study. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room or remotely using the Zoom application. Please note that the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entire committee. I would like to take this opportunity to remind all participants that...
Point of order?
Yes, Mr. Angus, on your point of order.
Sorry, yes. At the beginning of every meeting, when you read this, it takes about 10 minutes out of our time where we could be turning to questions. Could you just email us this? I mean, we are aware of the rules and regulations, but when you read it, it's really taking a lot of time out of our hearings, and my colleagues may not get around to questions. So is it possible just to email this to us at the beginning of every meeting?
Maybe just the stuff.
I've been advised that I'll work with the clerk to figure out how we can streamline the start of it. I'll go through the pieces that are relevant to the witnesses, if that's okay, because that'll be new information for them. So no photos or screenshots are allowed. Today's proceedings will be televised and made available via the House of Commons website.
So then we'll start with the third.
And then interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. And for the witnesses who are joining us, I'll ask you to speak in a normal fashion. We had a bit of an issue today where we had the MPs and the witnesses kind of talking over each other, which makes it impossible for the translators to do their job. So we ask that only one person to speak at a time and to allow for the translators to do their job, so don't speak too quickly either. Let's see, when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. And with that, if everybody's okay with it, we will move into the hearing. So this is a continuation of our study of a greenhouse gas emissions cap for the oil and gas sector. And I would like to welcome our panel of witnesses today. We have from the Canadian Association of Energy Contractors, Mark Schultz, President and Chief Executive Officer. We have the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers with Tim McMillan, President and Chief Executive Officer. We have Climate Action Network Canada, Caroline Bruyette, National Policy Manager. From the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, we have Tristan Goodman, President and Chief Executive Officer. And Shell Canada, Susanna Pierce, President and Country Chair. So welcome to each of our panelists. We're going to give you each 5 minutes for opening statements. I use a card system, so watch for the yellow card, which indicates there's 30 seconds left. When we get to the red card, your time is up. I'm trying to adopt a new system that Ms. Goodridge has given me, but I'm not quite there for today, so we'll go with the cards for one more, and then we'll see how it goes with a new system for timekeeping. But with that as an introduction, I'm going to go to Mr. Schultz for his opening comments, if you're ready. Just trying to see where you are on the screen, Mr. Schultz. And if you're good, okay, I will give you 5 minutes. You're good to go.
Well, merci beaucoup. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee. The issue of an emissions cap on the oil and gas sector is a very important one for our country. Our association represents Canadian energy service companies operating close to the wellhead. Our member companies employ tens of thousands of energy workers in the oil and gas industry and in emerging sectors such as hydrogen, helium, geothermal, LNG, lithium, and carbon capture utilization and storage. Canada's energy contractors recognize that governments and industry leaders from across the country and around the world have issued a challenge, and that's to make energy development cleaner and even more sustainable to meet ambitious climate targets. It is our belief that through partnership and collaboration with the Canadian oil and gas industry, that meeting Canada's climate goals are achievable. Industry supports the Government of Canada's goal to significantly reduce the GHG emission profile of our sector. But we strongly assert that the drive for net zero must not effectively become a cap on oil and natural gas production in Canada. Canada's energy industry is a willing partner in helping Canada reduce GHGs and ultimately achieve net zero emissions in our sector. We believe this energy transition is a technical challenge, but also a great economic opportunity. The production of cleaner oil and gas, development of alternative energy sources such as hydrogen and geothermal, and support for CCUS form a viable pathway to net zero. And it is one that supports Canadian energy workers and resource communities and our entire economy through the energy transition. As we as a country discuss how to lower emissions in our oil and gas sector, we must have this conversation realistically and practically and acknowledge some fundamental facts. The International Energy Agency continues to project growing demand for oil and natural gas in the coming decades. In fact, during the IEA's recent launch of its Canada 2022 report, the executive director emphasized Canada as being a cornerstone of global energy markets and should continue to be so. He stated, quote, "We still need oil and gas for years to come. I prefer that oil and gas is produced by countries like Canada who want to reduce emissions from oil and gas," end quote. This, with a record of over $3.5 billion invested since 2018 in technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, Canada's energy industry continues to be the largest investor in low carbon innovations, clean technologies, and environmental protection in the country. That's fact number one, that demand for oil and gas will continue through the energy transition, and Canada's oil and gas industry is the largest investor in emission reducing technology. Fact number two is that access to reliable, affordable, and secure sources of energy is essential to Canadian families and our economy. Without prudent and realistic planning, regulatory actions to reach net zero by 2050 may produce unintended consequences that could ultimately undermine Canada's climate commitments. The ongoing and escalating energy crisis in Europe demonstrates the need for energy affordability, reliability, and security as we tackle emission reductions. Fact number three is that the production of Canadian oil and gas employs hundreds of thousands of Canadians and are worth trillions of dollars to our economy in the coming decades. Within the context of continued global demand for oil and gas resources, Canada's net zero commitment should not result in unnecessary job loss, drastic increases to energy bills, or displaced economic activity to jurisdictions who do not share our commitment to climate action, environmental sustainability, or human rights. The fundamental point is that Canadian economic prosperity and energy security must be the foremost consideration as we move forward. In closing, Mr. Chair, we recommend that the Government of Canada leverage the innovation and expertise of Canada's oil and gas industry as it moves forward with this discussion, that it supports energy resource workers, and that it recognizes that Canada's energy sector can play a major role in producing needed net zero energy for global markets. We believe the entire upstream oil and gas industry can develop a unique competitive advantage moving forward. But to do that, we need the Government of Canada to support Canadian energy. Merci beaucoup.
Excellent. Right, so within the 5-minute time frame, that's wonderful. We're going to go right to Mr. McMillan, and you'll have 5 minutes, and then Ms. Bruyette will be next, so have you on deck. So Mr. McMillan, over to you for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. CAP appreciates the opportunity to be part of the committee study on a possible emission cap for the oil and gas sector in Canada. CAP members produce about 80% of Canada's natural gas and oil from the offshore in Newfoundland right across Canada to northeast British Columbia. Oil and gas in Canada is one of the largest investors in the economy, about $33 billion this year. We make up about 20% of Canada's exports. We're proud to be one of Canada's largest employers and to have a supply chain from coast to coast to coast. The importance of energy policy cannot be overstated, and an understanding of global energy system is essential to good policy. As the previous speaker noted, the International Energy Agency is putting out some very relevant content I think we should be aware of. In their base case, looking out to 2040, they see all forms of energy, including wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, bio, oil and gas, and coal, growing by about 20%. That's going to mean better diets, less poverty, more homes that get heating, and more freedom of movement for the poorest people around the world. Specific to oil and gas, in the IEA's base case, they expect oil to grow from its current 100 million barrels a day by about 6% out to 2040. They also expect natural gas to grow substantially from today about 390 billion cubic feet of gas. It's going to grow another 30% by 2040. At the end of the forecast, on a global basis, they expect just crude oil and natural gas to make up over 50% of primary energy demand worldwide. Meeting these substantial growing needs will not be easy, and doing it in an environmentally responsible way will take ongoing technology development, smart policy from government, and hard work in every nation on Earth. Unfortunately, even today, because of poor policy choices, there are some ongoing and new energy supply shortages that are having perverse social, economic, and environmental outcomes as a result. A few examples: the United States are appealing to OPEC to get more oil flowing. Europe is relying on Russia to secure more natural gas. We are seeing blackouts across Asia, and several European countries are reigniting coal-fired power plants, and Asian countries are building new coal-fired power plants to mitigate the damage of energy scarcity. Now to Canada and Canada's policy framework that an emissions cap could or would fit in. Over the past decade, Canada has rapidly been implementing policies and legislation with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These have included net zero legislation, carbon pricing with costs increasing to $170 a ton by 2030, multiple methane regulations, clean fuel regulations, output-based pricing systems, offset systems, and strategic assessments of climate change inside the regulatory process. This leaves us as a world leader, certainly, and makes us in some ways an outlier relative to our trading partners and our competitors. Carbon leakage is a reality today and is something that this committee must contemplate as they deliberate on these issues. Ultimately, this will likely lead to this could lead to greater global emissions as we see more coal being utilized than natural gas, and sources of supply for natural gas and oil coming from jurisdictions that don't have our high standards. So where does our industry stand? Well, to be clear, our industry and almost every company in it is committed to world-leading environmental performance. We are committed to improving on our production. We have a solid track record of showing reductions of emissions and on putting more technology into the field into the future. We would want the committee to ask themselves the question about would an emissions cap in the context of all of the policies that are currently in place have the effect of limiting coal use globally or sustaining it? Would it have the effect of increasing investment into jurisdictions like Canada with high environmental and social standards, or lessening them? And ultimately, would it meet the objectives that we're all working towards? So thank you for your consideration of CAP's point of view. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. I hope I didn't cut you off there, but the exchange with the MPs is always an important part of this. We'll try to keep it moving. Ms. Briette, I'll go to you next. I hope I'm not butchering your name. If I am, please feel free to correct me, and so everybody has the correct pronunciation for your name. And when you're finished your 5 minutes, we'll move to Mr. Goodman. So over to you, Ms. Briette, for your first 5 minutes.
That's a great pronunciation of my last name. Thank you. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les
Mr. Chairman, members of Parliament, thank you for having me. I join you from unceded Kanya lands, and I represent the Climate Action Network Canada, which brings together nearly 150 labour, development, faith, Aboriginal and environmental groups across the country working on climate change.
Capping oil and gas emissions is not only necessary for Canada to fulfill its international climate commitments, it is an opportunity to steer our economy towards a more competitive direction in a global context that is fast evolving. The transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy is happening. The question is, will we plan for it now and increase our economy and our society's resilience? Or will we wait to be left behind? The caps are an opportunity to position Canada as a proactive, people-centered leader of this global transformation. However, for this, some key principles will have to be respected, which I will focus my remarks on today. First, the decarbonization pathway for the oil and gas sector should align with the Paris Agreement objective to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. As a wealthy and high-emitting country, Canada has the capacity and the responsibility to lead globally in phasing out fossil fuel emissions and undertaking a just transition. The cap must reflect the rapidly shrinking global carbon budget and Canada's fair share of this global effort. The cap should also equitably share the decarbonization burden across Canadian economic sectors. The oil and gas sector accounts for the largest share of the country's emissions and have grown by 87% between 1990 and 2019. During the same period, emissions for electricity generation, for instance, have decreased by 36%. So the cap must avoid unfairly shifting the burden of mitigation from oil and gas to other sectors, other workers, and other consumers. Second, the emissions covered should reduce absolute emissions. Carbon intensity targets are an inadequate measure as they aim to only cut carbon pollution relative to output and do not result in overall reductions in emissions since production can expand while carbon intensity decreases. And this has been the story in Canada. On the compliance side, we must focus on getting to zero, then on the net and net zero. This means we cannot rely on offsets or hypothetical emissions reductions from carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects that have yet to be commissioned and have failed to demonstrate actual emissions reductions. The cap should factor in the full life cycle of greenhouse gases, including Scope 3 emissions. In 2019, emissions from Canada's exported fossil fuels were 954 megatons, while domestic emissions were at 730 megatons of CO2. If we are serious about cutting emissions, we need to take responsibility for the gargantuan carbon footprint of the fossil fuels we ship overseas. Third, it is absolutely essential that this policy comes with strong and sufficient just transition mechanisms that ensure no workers and communities are left behind. The Just Transition Act that has been promised by the government must set up an advisory working group in charge of establishing the process, mechanisms, tools, and funding for a just transition. Unions must be consulted from the beginning of planning and be part of this group, and the funding that comes with the Act must also be scaled up. Fourth, the cap must have robust compliance mechanisms that are properly enforced. It should avoid any relief valves for industry that could reduce the policy's stringency. There should be strong deterrence mechanisms that do not allow companies to internalize these as a cost of doing business. Fifth, the cap should foster additional emissions reductions. There are already existing and planned Canadian regulations that aim to limit and reduce the emissions of the oil and gas sector. Carbon pricing through the output-based pricing system, as well as methane regulations and the Clean Fuel Standard. The caps should be a new additional policy that requires additional emissions reductions. Finally, and importantly, the policy must uphold Indigenous rights and authority affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in its design and implementation. Merci beaucoup, mesdames et messieurs, membres.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. It'd be my pleasure to have an exchange with you during the question and answer period.
Thank you for your opening comments right on the 5-minute mark. Perfect. We will go to Mr. Goodman for your 5 minutes, and then we'll hear from our final introductory comments, Ms. Pierce. So, Mr. Goodman, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that's coming through okay there. I first want to acknowledge I am speaking to you today from Treaty 7 lands. I also want to acknowledge the federal government for a successful engagement approach here. I don't think they're far down the road here, and there's lots of opportunities for everybody to participate. Much appreciated. My name is Tristan Goodman. I represent the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, whose members develop a substantial amount of oil, natural gas, and well as increasing amount of renewables across Canada. Really, the debate and discussion on any GHG emissions cap will likely involve four key components prior to implementation. A policy driver for the cap, why a cap is needed, the policy principles, which I'll go over today, determining the specific cap, impacts, and other aspects of that. And then finally, once that has been moved forward, we'll be able to have a broader conversation on the exact mechanisms of how to go about implementing such a cap. I will focus today my comments on key design principles and suggest that any emission cap should involve the following 6 principles. First, where possible, use existing climate policy frameworks and build on successful results. Federal and provincial policies adopted over the past several years are reducing GHG emissions. Emissions reductions are being achieved at pace, and significant economic activity has been generated because of the investments by the energy industry, as among others, which support an expanding domestic clean tech sector. And there is a very substantive growing clean tech sector in Canada, which I think everybody here would acknowledge is quite positive. As the number of discrete climate policies grow, so does the potential for unintended interactions and policy consequences, thus the importance of using existing policy frameworks where possible. The second principle is a market-based approach should be used wherever reasonable or possible. It won't be the only approach, but markets, if nothing else, are ruthlessly efficient, and efficiency is going to be important within the endeavor to move quickly to GHG reductions. Limiting programs to in-sector compliance would limit the sector's ability to drive the clean energy transformation of the Canadian economy. The third principle, an emissions cap should be technology neutral and support all subsectors. Climate policy programs should support technologies based on their carbon reduction results. Likewise, no one subsector of the industry should be disadvantaged through policy decisions. All companies, regardless of product or size, should be able to participate in the energy transition. The fourth principle is carbon leakage, already mentioned, and any resulting Canadian economic competitiveness concerns should be considered in the policy design. Policies should address carbon leakage to protect domestic economic interests, as well as Canada's monetary policy and balance of trade. The fifth principle relates to policy predictability. And this will, policy predictability, drive investment. This is probably the most key over the next 12 months. There has to be increased levels of uncertainty. If you want additional investment, if that's the goal, then we need to make sure these policies are evaluated in a way that investors can see their long-term implementation. That's what will draw money into the sector. There are many opportunities here, but that would be one of the key points here, that we have got to increase predictability around policy. The final principle that I would raise is Indigenous reconciliation should be a central consideration to any emissions cap. The future of natural resource development in a Canadian context relies on genuine, respectful, and real Indigenous reconciliation. And this should be a core design consideration as you move forward on the cap. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. And Ms. Pierce, if you're ready, we will go right into your 5-minute opening statement so we can get to our round of questions and answers.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And hopefully folks can hear me okay. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I am calling myself from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
On a point of order, Mr. Chair, the sound is inadequate for interpretation purposes.
Okay.
Shall we check that?
If you have the microphone, right, I don't know, close to the mouth, we'll just do a quick check to make sure.
Oh, is this better?
From the interpreters, can you hear that better?
Is it quite? I feel.
She doesn't have light.
Hello, this is the clerk of the committee. Perhaps I can help.
Ms. Pierce, if you can make sure your microphone is selected on the bottom left-hand corner and choose your headset versus speaker. I think that might be the issue.
Indeed, I have my headphones set. It is, the microphone should also be the same. Is it better now? Sounds like it.
Interpreters are shaking their heads. No, they're not able to pick it up.
That is strange. It's worked yesterday.
Okay, perhaps we can try one more thing. Can you plug and unplug your headset again?
Sure.
Again? Yeah, let's try that. Thank you.
How is this? How is this?
Talk a full sentence so the interpreters can see
I'm
this.
checking, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is this any better?
She needs to lift it higher.
Oh, if you can lift it just a little bit, the
1,
mouthpiece.
2, 3, 4.
Right.
Is that
Okay,
any
keep
better?
talking. We're getting a thumbs up from the
Keep talking.
interpreters.
Getting a thumbs up. That sounds wonderful.
No, one of the interpreter booths is not getting it.
Okay, I'm going to keep talking until you tell me not to talk.
Yeah, keep going. Maybe give us a weather report from where you're at in the lands.
It is cloudy with a chance of sunshine. Does that sound any better?
Just keep her talking.
Yeah, keep talking.
Okay, why don't I'm calling you the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I am in good health and spirits as I look around the Zoom call. I hope you are too, wherever you are. I see Tristan nodding. I know that you are. Always in positive spirits. Good to see you. Tim, others. Is this any better?
Just
If I
looking
begin.
for to our interpreters to see if they're hearing it.
Is this any better? If you can thumbs up, I can see you. Can you see me? How are things in Ottawa today? For those that are in Ottawa.
Hello, Ms. Pierce. This is the clerk again. Will you just double check that your microphone is selected? If you look at the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom screen, your microphone, we should say microphone and headset.
Yeah, it is microphone connects, and this is the exact same thing I used yesterday in the tech check.
Thank you.
So we're good to go. I will start the clock. I had stopped it here, so please carry on with your comments, and then we'll get into our questions and answers.
Wonderful. So I am grateful to have the opportunity to share Shell's experience in target setting and our views on the proposed...
1 second, Ms. Pierce. Your microphone seems to move. We're getting some popping now, or so move it up just a little bit. Yeah, try there. Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to keep going. Is this better now for folks? All right. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share Shell's experience in target setting and our views on the proposed oil and gas emissions cap alongside the group of leading Canadian thinkers on energy that you have gathered here today. As a preface to my remarks, Shell has set a target to be net zero by 2050 on emissions from our operations and emissions resulting from the use of all the energy products we sell. We've also set nearer term targets for reducing our scope 1 and 2 emissions by half by 2030 and continuing to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to net zero by 2050. Given our corporate commitment to reduce emissions from oil and gas production and consumption, we humbly offer some views for consideration as Canada advances an emissions cap on the oil and gas sector. First, let's talk about sectors. Shell believes that in order for governments to deliver the reductions needed, net zero targets must be supported by strategies and plans to accelerate decarbonization of each sectors of the economy while actively managing the relationship and dependencies between the sectors. We are not alone in this view, given the role that energy and land use change plays in driving greenhouse gas emissions within all sectors. If we consider the power sector, which drives our scope 2 emissions, we are limited in how much we can reduce based on the access to renewable power and affordable cost, along with backup generation when the wind doesn't blow or sun doesn't shine. As we drive decarbonization in the transportation sector, we are limited by how much lower carbon energy we can produce by the speed in which the harder to abate and electrify sectors in each sector, such as heavy-duty trucking, aviation, and marine, invest in their own lower carbon energy technologies and are willing to pay a green premium for lower carbon fuels. The oil and gas sector, unlike other sectors, is trade exposed and has its own unique decarbonization pathway informed by affordability and accessibility of technology options in the domestic market, abatement costs, and how these costs can be passed along. These are all important considerations as we contemplate emissions caps, sectoral targets, and their corresponding impact on investment in economic growth in the oil and gas sector, but also other sectors of the Canadian economy. So in short, policies targeting emissions reductions in the oil and gas sector, like an emissions cap, must not be developed in isolation. We should recognize that Canada has already made significant progress in establishing policies and regulations that encourage emissions reductions, like my colleagues have said. Existing systems such as the federal fuel charge, regulated methane emissions reduction targets, and the output-based pricing system have supported greenhouse gas abatement initiatives across the country. And the soon-to-be implemented clean fuel regulation will drive further reductions in the industry while growing the availability of lower carbon transportation options. Targets and related strategies for the oil and gas sector should take into account the incremental and integrated effect of existing policies and regulations at both the federal and provincial level to ensure that they are working in harmony to deliver and even accelerate emissions reductions while also avoiding negative or unintended consequences. Some of these climate policies have already inspired early action, which I will speak to next. Just as sectors have different capacities, opportunities, and challenges in achieving net zero, so do companies. Some companies are more advanced in their emissions reductions journey, having taken investment decisions earlier on, even when economic returns were neutral to negative and with considerable risk. The Shell-operated Quest carbon capture and storage facility, which safely captures and stores more than 1 million tons of CO2 each year for a total of approximately 6 million tons to date, is a useful example. Shell was incentivized to take early action through the systems in place under Alberta's heavy emitters regulation. Therefore, imposing an emissions cap at this stage should not penalize early actors. Further, I should add that different companies have different emissions profiles and abatement cost curves. As such, policy, as my friend Tristan suggests, should be technology neutral and flexible, providing companies with options to reduce emissions over a given time horizon. Now let me turn to emissions reductions at home and the corresponding risk and opportunity for emissions reductions abroad. Canada can only be credible in advancing decarbonization in other countries if it has taken clear and measurable steps towards meeting its own climate commitments. But it's equally clear that meeting our own domestic commitments won't be enough to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. With growing populations and increasing demands for energy in other parts of the world, Canada must not ignore how domestic policy may drive emissions to other jurisdictions, but equally the role it can play in helping to drive lower carbon energy in the fastest growing energy consuming countries in the world. Therefore, continued attention to the risk of carbon leakage and the opportunity presented by Article 6 of the Paris Agreement should be considered part and parcel to an emissions cap. Similarly, carbon border adjustments need to be reviewed carefully as they could advantage some exports from Canada, but also disadvantage some imports needed in the energy transition that are manufactured in carbon-intensive jurisdictions. I often reflect on how Shell's net zero journey reflects, to an extent, the country's journey. If we could flick a switch and achieve net zero tomorrow, wouldn't that be great? But we know it doesn't work that way, and there is no quick fix, given the relationships and interdependencies between sectors, producers, and consumers. We have to walk this tightrope carefully. If we move too quickly, failing to produce the energy that consumers need today, prices go up, creating real hardship, particularly on those with the lowest capacity to pay. If we move too slow or not at pace, we miss the opportunity to grow revenues, gain market share, and meet the demands of lower carbon energy customer base. Amidst this uncertainty, I do, though, believe that the longer we wait to tackle emissions reductions across and between sectors, the more challenging and costly it will be to meet our climate targets. Therefore, we must work together to accelerate emissions reductions by scaling up and commercializing lower carbon energy technologies while producing the energy consumers need today. Let's also keep in mind the workers and communities that have depended on oil and gas for their livelihoods.
Ms. Pierce, sorry, I'm just going to ask you if you can just wrap it up. Although you had
a
perfect.
These are good people who have worked tirelessly to provide affordable and reliable energy that we often take for granted. We must continue to keep these workers available and to adapt to the lower carbon energy economy where it requires different skill sets. If we do this right, we will find that we create the right investment conditions that contribute to growth, carbon reductions, and equally important, advance economic reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada. On this latter point of Indigenous reconciliation, I know how important it is to build true, trusted, and lasting partnerships with Indigenous communities. The energy transition can provide, like my friend Chief Elected Council Crystal Smith at the HISA will say, a share and a say. So in closing, the oil and gas sector must continue to show leadership and reduce emissions while providing affordable energy across our economy. We are ready to help the government design the pathways and look forward to continued collaboration.
Pardon.
Okay, thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairperson, I just wanted to point out that for the interpreters, it would be easier if panelists gave their opening remarks earlier, ahead of time, because their task is far more complicated without the text at hand. Also, the final panelist took a little bit more time than would normally be allocated, took more time than the other panelists, and that took away from our questioning time.
I gave an extra minute and a half just because of the technical issues that we had at the beginning. But I get your point, and I'll work with the team to see if we can get the opening statements to our interpreters in advance. So now what we're going to do is go into the rounds, the interactions. We're going to try to get as far through the first full round, which takes 74 minutes. I don't think we'll make it through the entire list of questions or the full rotation, but we'll get as far as we can so we can aim to wind up as close to 5:30 as possible. We do, for the panelists, so you know, I give a fair amount of latitude to the member who is asking the questions. They will direct the questions to whomever they like. And if you have something you'd like to say, you can raise your hand, but it is up to the member to recognize you. They will very much guide the round or the direction that their questions will take. So with that as preamble or context, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Goodridge for her first 6 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I am very proud to be the Member of Parliament for the riding of Fort McMurray Cold Lake, and an area where Indigenous communities have been partners in prosperity for decades. In 2019 alone, oil sands companies did nearly $2.4 billion in procurement in Indigenous-owned businesses. And I think that that's critically important to highlight. And so I was just wondering, perhaps I'll first direct this question to Mr. McMillan. What impact would you expect the emissions cap to have on Indigenous businesses in the oil sands or more generally in the oil sector in general?
I think that that's a great question. I think that understanding how it would work, how it would be implemented, where it would be set, all of those would be crucially important before we would be able to understand that in detail. I would note that a few of the other panelists noted the UNDRIP legislation and the reconciliation and involvement of Indigenous communities in the oil and gas sector. I think it would also be worthy of this committee contemplating, would this legislation include Indigenous production, as there is substantial Indigenous resource across Canada and production today. So I think there's a lot of those questions that really should be contemplated before early on in this process.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. That was the next question I was going to go to, of whether the federal government even has the authority to impose an emission cap that would affect production on First Nations land. And I was just wondering, maybe I'll open up to all the panelists if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Feel free if anyone wants to jump in.
Well, I can certainly jump in. I appreciate the opportunity. To be honest, I'm not sure. I could certainly, a number of us legal type people could certainly examine that, but I would encourage the federal government to consider their legal authority under the Constitution and their duties to consult, as well as any provincial associated division of powers.
You could possibly provide the committee with any legal work that you're aware of. That would be, just in writing, that would be spectacular. And I was just wondering, to go a little bit further into this, do you think that this cap will change future opportunities for Indigenous economic development? Again, to Mr. Goodman.
I think a lot of the questions on the cap, and that was sort of my points in the beginning of the opening statement. The oil sands actually, as many know, actually has a cap. And I think, the reality is there was a consultation process to move forward on that. That's now being expanded into a broader set. It really has yet to be determined exactly what this will entail. So at this point in time, it's very difficult to actually answer that question without seeing exactly where we're going. We're going to need to know what are the drivers of this cap. How does it fit into existing policy? What exactly is the cap, and what principles will it be based on? And then I think you can actually get into the details of answering your question. Thank you.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. So then, do you think that capping the energy sector by using a sector-by-sector approach would be a more efficient model?
I'm going to assume, member, that you're directing that question towards myself.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, I apologize. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify. There are multiple different ways you can go about doing this. A sector by sector, a geographic location, you could download to provincial jurisdictions. You have many different options, and there are many different caps across this country on different sectors, and they're all done actually quite differently. So again, it may be one of the options available. I guess I'd go back up if we could work through sort of what's the main issue we're missing in the existing policy framework, and that's a very credible, legitimate question. And then moving into what would the design principles be, you'll be able to get into those other components as you move through that. Thank you.
Got very few minutes left in this round of questioning. And so I was just wondering, Mr. McMillan, do you support having a sector-by-sector approach to emissions?
You know, I think that we would want to enable Canadians and all Canadian sectors to do their part globally. That the capacity for Canadian oil and gas, be it gas, oil, offshore, to displace higher emission coal or higher emission oil and gas from other places around the world, we should not impede that with a cap. That we should link it to global demand and encourage Canada to play a larger role, not a smaller role. So I think those would be the frames I'd put on it, as opposed to trying to break our industry and other industries into smaller sectors.
Fantastic. And what about to Mr. Schultz really quickly?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I would echo what Mr. Goodman and Mr. McMillan were expressing. I mean, one of the things I just would want to point out that whatever framework gets decided on, that jobs and job creation and potential elimination of jobs are taken in consideration. I mean, I represent companies that are ultimately work for oil and gas producers, and we are the ones that are ultimately creating most of the kind of variable jobs all across the country on drilling rigs, service rigs, directional drilling rig companies. So in the context of whatever framework and principles that we look at, we have to put in the consideration for impact to employment within as a prominent focal point for the discussion.
Great, thank you. And that's the end of that first round of questions. Ms. Jones, is over to you now for your 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to welcome all of our panelists. Thank you for your excellent presentations today. So I'm a member of Parliament in Newfoundland and Labrador. My riding is in Labrador, and I come to you from the lands of the Inuit and the Innu people of our community. So my first question today is going to be for Mr. McMillan. First of all, I loved in your presentation when you said your group is committed to world-leading performance on reducing emissions. I think that's the goal that we all want to set, the standard we want to set in Canada. And it's great to hear it coming from some of the people that we know are going to be necessary to lead this process. So my first question is to you. In your opinion, and that of the members that you represent, what is the most effective way that you can see the federal government implementing this cap on the oil and gas sector emissions?
Great question. And, you know, I think if we look at the example of Canada, and it's been repeated other places, one of the other panelists noted that our electricity sector was one of the largest reducers of greenhouse gases. And in Canada, that is because we shut down our coal industry and we replaced it largely with natural gas. Certainly we put it on more wind and solar. In Canada, wind and solar, I think, are about 3 to 5% of our production, but the massive reduction came with phasing out of coal and putting in gas. Same is true in the United States, their biggest reduction. Same is true in Europe. And as we look at the biggest reduction we can make globally, it is in Asia and in India. So I would like to see any new legislation be targeting Canada to play a large global role. And I think that it would have to be recognized in a piece of legislation like you're contemplating here, that this is about global reductions. We can pat ourselves on the back in Canada for a Canadian reduction that ironically has a negative impact globally. That would be bad for all of us.
Good, thank you. And I love your perspective on that. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a lot of questions, so I'm going to move as quickly as I can. I'm going to come to you, Mr. Goodman. I love your 6 principles. And I love it when you talk about not just the 6 principles to reducing emissions in the industry, but when you talk about the fact that the existing climate change policies that we have in place in Canada is working, and coming from someone so closely to the industry, that do account for a great deal, in my opinion. I'd like to ask you if you could speak to the ways that the federal and the provincial governments should be working together, because as you know, there are certain provinces in Canada that will be impacted tremendously by anything that we do in terms of the cap and emissions. So I'd like to ask you how we can work together to create stability and certainty for the industry, especially those in those particular provinces that will be impacted as we work to introduce this cap and bring forward the legislation.
Well, thank you very much, MP Jones. I think there's really 2 items there that are critical. There actually has been tremendously good work between the federal government and the provinces in every single jurisdiction, actually. And that has resulted in some improvements, enhancements, movement forward that I think both federal and provincial governments can take credit for. Changes to methane requirements and seeing that emission trend move down, that is constructive, that is positive. And looking at some of the movement from investment, and they link together here, into the clean tech sector. So what you're actually seeing a lot of the time now is you're seeing oil and gas companies evolving and changing actually often into energy companies. And that there's going to be a consistent mix as you move forward. When I speak about predictability for investment, what investors do, and there's trillions of dollars, far more money than is actually in any federal, provincial, or in the entire Canadian economy, that will move into these areas. But what they have to be able to do is have understandable policies. They have to be able to see when they run their metrics, these policies actually work, and that will drive investment. So when I talk about predictability and certainty, it's actually about the reality of those policies. They have to move forward on this critical issue, but they often have to be seen by investors to be able to sort of work within the numbers they operate in. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, do I have time for one more question?
Yeah, 40 seconds.
Okay, very quickly. I'm going to go to Susanna, only because as an Indigenous Canadian myself and representing a large Indigenous riding, I know that any transition affects vulnerable communities more, and it will affect the Indigenous community. They are largely employed by the oil and gas sector. What are some recommendations that we should be looking at as the Government of Canada to minimize the risks that will face those most vulnerable?
Thank you, MP Jones, for the question and recognizing time. I think we need to involve them in the conversation quite clearly and quite directly. I think they need to be a part of any decisions that we make in decarbonization. In fact, they do have an opportunity to participate in some of the new projects that we'd be looking forward to, including carbon capture sequestration, including some of the renewable energy projects we'll be looking at, cleaner fuels, renewable diesel. It all, basically will happen on the land and from the land. So I think they're a part of this conversation, and I think there's an opportunity to make sure that they also prosper as a result of this.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're going to now move over to Monsieur Simard, who has 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Since I don't have much time, I'm going to ask you to respond succinctly, Mr. Goodman and Mr. McMillan, perhaps by yes or no. In your opinion, without financial support from the government, will the oil and gas sector be capable of capping its emissions?
Est-ce que la traduction fonctionne?
Did the interpretation come through?
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Yes, it did indeed.
Sure. I think that as global demand is increasing, that Canada should be playing a larger role, that there are demands around the world of people improving their lives and coming out of...
Pardon, monsieur.
Sorry to cut you off, Mr. McMillan and Mr. Goodman. I just would like a succinct yes or no answer. Without financial support from the government, are you able to cap your emissions? Yes or no?
I think that we should be aspiring to play a larger role in global supply, and that's inconsistent with government support or non-support.
Vous seriez bon en politique.
Well, you'd be a good politician, Mr. McMillan, I must say.
Monsieur Goodman, je vais peut-être vous fournir la...
Well, perhaps I can give you the answer, and I think that the answer is no. When an economic sector relies on government funding, it's an economic sector that is not profitable. So to my mind, the oil and gas sectors that are low emissions are not profitable. And the proof is in the pudding. The two carbon capture projects in Alberta, $2.5 billion, if I'm not mistaken. 59% of it comes from the public purse, and i.e. Alberta and the federal government. So the strategy that you've alerted to, well, many people say that it's a bit of a mirage, in fact, this whole notion of having an oil and a gas sector that has a low carbon emissions. Are you in agreement with me on that point, at least?
You know, I think that the largest reductions Canada has made is putting more natural gas onto our electricity system, and we should be aspiring to do that around the world.
I would echo the comments. I would effectively say that, look, we have many partnerships in Canada, and many industries rely on partnerships with various governments and across multiple sectors. And those providing strong policy is going to be important. And there are going to have to be considerations as you move forward on what partnerships are important. Some of that may include financial considerations, some of it may not.
Est-ce que vous êtes au fait?
Are you aware of a quite straightforward principle in the environmental sphere, such that to ensure that new energy technologies that are low carbon footprint, to make them get developed, you have to invest. Unfortunately, in Canada, year after year, the energy sector that has the lion's share is the oil and gas sector. Now, Mr. McMillan, I think, said earlier that we're talking about $33 billion injected by the oil sector in the Canadian economy. If it's $24 billion that the federal government is investing in that area, do you still believe that that is an economically viable sector for Canada?
The oil and gas sector is one of the largest contributors to the Government of Canada's coffers, as well as provinces and municipalities. We do that proudly. I believe that on the 5-year average, it's between $7 and $15 billion a year contributed to governments across the country, and we're proud to do it.
I guess I would respond, there's no question that it's a major economic driver. And additional to that, the reality is it is actually, as many governments are indicating, one of the key ways that you're going to be able to move through an energy transition in a successful manner.
Je vais peut-être vous donner un exemple.
Well, I'll perhaps give you a simple example to demonstrate the scope of the federal support to the oil and gas sector. The pipeline cost the federal government about $17 billion based on estimations. The federal government announced a recovery plan, a green recovery plan, to the tune of $17 billion. One single project, $17 billion, and the entire recovery plan, $17 billion. And when you look at that, you see subsidies to fossil fuels. Now, I get the sense, unless you can demonstrate otherwise, that by yourselves you can cut emissions, it is my sense that the oil and gas sector lives off the backs, is reliant on the state when it comes to reducing its carbon footprint. Unless you can demonstrate otherwise, I invite you to do so. Perhaps the sector can invest in carbon capture technologies, but remain a true skeptic.
Yeah, appreciate your point of view, committee member. We have been working on technologies for years and implementing them for years. We have a long track record of lowering our greenhouse gas emissions on our production across the board, oil sands, conventional and offshore. And that's just on our production. The effect we've had on the power sector, as I mentioned earlier, is the biggest reduction that Canada has overall and has truly moved the needle in the way no other industry has been able to. So, there's no silver bullet here. There's no single piece of technology that's going to get us there, but we're committed to continue to do the work that we can and should do as technology drivers from industry's point of view.
I would actually.
Il y a un principe assez simple.
Well, the principle is quite simple. No other sector pollutes as much as yours does. So this is a basic principle, is it not?
We're going to have to end at this one. We're just a little bit over, equal to what the other two before you have gone over. And now we're going to go to Mr. Angus for his 6 minutes.
Well, I thank all the witnesses for testifying today. Mr. McMillan, what I hear from you is you say no cap, that your solution to the environmental crisis is to increase production to serve the global need. Is that correct?
I think that whatever policy we put in place needs to be efficient and work with the other policies that Canada has put in place to lower emissions. And it has to be done in the context of global realities. Canada plays a unique role.
You said, I had heard you say no cap. So you're saying that we could play a role. So you're saying we would increase production to meet that global role? Or would the cap be on production now?
So I think that there are several ways to implement a cap. I think that we would not want to limit Canada's ability to play a major role in global reductions.
So
and
you're
I think
saying
our industry can have a role.
But
in
would that mean that would mean an increase of production? I'm just trying to get a straight answer here.
Yeah. No. So just absolutely clear. The largest reduction in Canada is phasing out coal. We can play a major role in doing that globally by increasing our production.
Increasing production. Okay, that's good. I just like people to be clear.
Yeah, appreciate that.
And so we're looking at increased production. I listened to your comments on the International Energy Agency, and I read their 2050 report on net zero, and they talk about prosperity, but they talked about prosperity as being tied to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, and they say we aren't even close to that. They say that greenhouse gas emissions have risen dramatically, and they have risen dramatically in Canada. We are now the most carbon intensive site on the planet. And the International Energy Agency says to meet our targets, there's no new fossil fuel projects to come online. Would you agree with that?
So the International Energy Agency has several different scenarios. I referenced their base case. They did put out several other scenarios. The one that you reference is their 1.0 scenario. Yeah. So each of them use different metrics in how they calculate.
I know that, but I'm just wondering if the International Energy Agency, which is, they aren't radicals. I don't think they vote New Democrat, and they probably don't vote Socialist. But if they say there's no new energy projects from fossil fuels coming online to meet the target that the IPCC has set, can you maintain your level of production or increase it based on the existing projects, or are you supporting new projects to come online?
Yeah. Again, that is one of their scenarios where they have some very specific criteria that goes into it. But I think, a question for this committee, if global demand is going to increase, if people around the world are looking for better lives, should that energy be coming from coal or from natural gas? Should it be coming from Canada or from Kazakhstan? And I will pick Canadian resources any day.
I guess the issue that we can't tell from your argument is that we've been told that what happens to bitumen that's burned in China doesn't count. The only thing that counts is at as in the sands and at the wellhead. But if we're not counting all the actual impacts of burning a barrel of oil. How do you tell us the world will be better off by us shipping bitumen, which is right now is the highest carbon intensive source on the planet, that it gets burned someplace else, but we don't count that, and yet we then say that we are actually net zero? That doesn't make sense. Come on.
No, and I guess factually, there are different intensities of carbon oils from around the world. Bitumen from Canada is not the highest, so just factually that's not correct. But if China is going to enable their citizens to have better diets, and they need energy from Canada or from Kazakhstan or from Venezuela, I think that the world is better served with responsibly produced Canadian energy.
I think China's doing pretty good with its diets right now, so I don't think we have to say that bitumen from the Fort McMurray is going to keep people from starving. Because, and I'm not arguing with you, I'm just saying this is how the world is seeing us. When the Wall Street Journal writes an article this January and refers to our oil industry as being one of the world's dirtiest oil patches, that's a black eye. And when they say that all the major investment banks have pulled out of Canada because we don't have a credible investment plan, that's a black eye. When the New York Times writes that that the world investors are leaving dirty fuel, and they talk about Canada, that's a black eye. So I think you should be coming to our committee and saying, we are committed to a cap, which I haven't heard. We're committed to serious reductions, and being an industry that's awash with money right now, we're willing to put the money on the line. Is that something you guys are willing to do?
Yeah, I think that your question is very good, and I wanted to be clear in my opening comments that our industry is committed to continuous improvement. We are committed to efficient climate policy. We are committed to being world class, and we will continue to improve upon
I thank
the
you
work
for
we've
that.
done.
I just, I come from a resource region, but when I see the Washington Post saying that we have the dirtiest sites on the planet, that's not good enough, not for our country, and we need to do better. And that's why we have to talk about this cap in a credible manner.
Appreciate your point of view.
Thank you.
Charlie, you still have about 25 seconds if you want.
There, I thought you were like waving that yellow card at me.
You know what? Everybody else went 25 seconds over. If you want to jump, I'm giving you one quick question.
It's all right. No. Now you've thrown me off my game. I've been completely thrown off. Go ahead. Give it to someone else. I know what you're up to.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Mr. McGuire, who will have 5 minutes for his round of questions. Mr. McGuire, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses today for your testimony here before this committee. I've been a big proponent of trying to put incentives in place, I guess, if you would, to be able to develop the technology that would help reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world, not just right here in Canada. And so I'm very pleased to hear your presentation today, Mr. McMillan, in regards to, the impacts of the high emissions in other areas of the world. I believe, though, that our 1.6 we should do everything we can to get it to zero as well. But can you just expand on your comments there? Because if we do the very best thing that we can do in our own zone here and reduce it, say cut it in half to 0.8%, something like that, are we in fact just not allowing other areas of the world to fill in the gap, I guess, and you're saying they may do it with coal, they may do it with high carbon energy as opposed to the low carbon energy that we have.
Yeah, and I guess I'm reflecting what we're seeing happen today, that today we're seeing coal-fired power plants coming back online in Europe and new ones being built in Asia. I think that to get to our ultimate goals, which is the 1.5 or less, it's going to take all of the tools that we have, including the ones that we work on today that won't be ready for implementation for 5, 10, or 15, 20 years from now. So I think that we need to take an approach that is all-inclusive, utilizing the best technology and resource we have today, and work like heck to make sure that we have good answers in the years ahead. Thanks.
I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that or not. I think, Mr. Goodman, would you have a comment on the technology side of it as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of comments. First, we all recognize we have a serious problem before us here. And the reality is that we are making progress. There's quite a few positives. First, we are seeing the emergence of this clean tech sector. Many of the members that we're representing are actually invested in that and producing some positive results. So there's also another benefit that as you move forward and you reduce, people are recognizing that our products are moving down, and they're willing actually in some cases to pay an additional premium for those products. That actually gives Canada a potential competitive advantage. But it is about how fast and where do you put your resources into this, recognizing that this is a global problem, not just a domestic problem. And there is a commitment here, but we have to find ways to fit into that broader global problem. Thank you.
Yeah, we export wheat around the world so we can provide people with better food. And I get where you're coming from on the energy sector as well. I was in Taiwan a few years ago, and they said they would buy all the liquid natural gas we could sell them if we could just get our act together to get it to them. And Ms. Pierce, you indicated that you've done a lot of technological changes in Shell over the years. I know the companies have. Could you just outline one or two of those for me?
Sure, and maybe I could just comment on the important relationship that we have with customers that drive demand. I don't think that's been really identified as well as it needs to be, because we can produce cleaner energy. And I'll give hydrogen as an example. In Vancouver, we've had 2 hydrogen refueling stations for years. The challenge we have is nobody's driving hydrogen cars, and that the trucks that could consume the hydrogen are not yet economic for the truckers. So for us to produce the cleaner energy with or without subsidy or any kind of government incentive, we need to have that relationship with customers. That then incentivizes us to make the investments so that they can, in fact, take that energy, which would be lower emissions. So outside of the fact, so technology can be driven by customer demand. And as I mentioned, we're in this unique place today because our customers have made net zero commitments, which then helps us to help meet those commitments with lower carbon energy. Technology also today that's not economic simply because it's not yet at scale. It hasn't been fully commercialized. If we want to accelerate it because it's necessary to meet our climate commitments, there is a role for government to help us do that through regulation, through incentives, because in and of itself, it won't happen in the time that we need it. I think carbon capture sequestration is an example of that. And it is a technology that works, and it is a technology that every credible climate report recognizes is critical to meet our net zero targets.
It's kind of a similar question to that I'll ask you, Ms. Pierce, in regards to what I just asked the others.
Sorry, that's the end of the time, so you might have to wait for the next go-around. It goes fast, the 5 minutes does. My apologies. And sorry, Mr. Schultz, we didn't get to you. I saw your hand up, but we're going to jump right to Ms. Lapointe for your 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. We heard earlier today from the Net Zero Advisory Board, and they said that globally, we have lost the opportunity for an emissions reduction paradigm by failing to act. And now we're forced to shift to an emissions elimination paradigm. Now, the Net Zero Advisory Board went on to say that this means a change in the onus of leadership, that this no longer requires just one federal department, but every federal agency, every province and territory, every municipal government, and especially the private sector to act. So from what I understand from the advisory board is that it's no longer a question of what can the government do, but rather what can everyone do, especially the private sector. So my question is for both Ms. Pierce and Madame Brouillette. In applying this testimony to the oil and gas emissions cap program, where can we look outside the government to partner efforts to help this program's success in reducing emissions? Ms. Pierce first, and then Madame Brouillette.
Thank you. Again, I think we do have a role in the private sector to work with customers within a given sector to see what would it take for them to consume lower carbon energy and what are those pathways. If I take sustainable aviation fuel, for example, if airlines have the aircraft that can take 100% sustainable aviation fuel, if we can create the technologies and build them at scale to produce it and meet their demands, then we at least have those two endpoints from the production to the consumption to work between. The cost of that and the transmission of that fuel from where it's produced, the inputs to that and to how it's consumed needs to be managed as part of that pathway. So as a private sector and working with a non-private sector or the public sector and nonprofit sector, we can convene sectors in which we can discuss the pathways, in which we can look at the opportunities and the constraints to help us meet climate targets. We are in a stage of reducing, but in order to eliminate, we need to reduce. I mean, the fastest way to shut emissions down is to shut down the economy, and we don't want to do that. So we do have to have pathways for reductions that manage and mind how energy is being consumed and what type of energy is being consumed today, so that we don't strand people, so that we can meet demands, so we don't see prices. Sorry, thank you.
That's okay. Madame Bria.
Oui, merci pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. I'll take this opportunity to correct a number of facts about what's been said previously. First, it's important to note that when it comes to emissions from the gas and oil sector, they've increased to the tune of 89% since 1990. So we are at a point where government intervention is crucial, and world demand, regardless of what my co-panelists believe, if we really want to avoid a climate disaster and go above this 1.5 increase in temperature, the International Energy Agency in its net zero report stated that we've already reached the cap of global demand for oil, and that in the case of gas will occur in the middle of this decade. So the question here is, how is Canada going to benefit from this lowering demand with a view to avoiding climate disaster? And of course, every country thinks that it's a last man standing, and they will be the ones producing gas and oil. That's the fact of the matter. It costs a lot of money to produce. Now, the fact is that capping these emissions gives us a golden opportunity to transition our economy gradually by putting workers and communities at the centre and diversifying towards sectors that are competitive on the world stage, where transition is already underway. Thank you very much. I'll ask my next question to both of you.
So I'll need a quick response again. So one thing I've noticed is that the necessity of having a net zero economy by 2050 is unanimously recognized across science, governments, and industry. But conversely, the how or the path to get to this goal is anything but unanimous. A declining emissions cap is a significant action in the right direction. So what would be your top recommendation, the one thing you see as non-negotiable in terms of a pathway of placing a declining cap on the oil and gas emissions? Madame Brouillard, on peut commencer avec vous.
Ms. Brouillard, we could start with you if you'd like. Well, for the Climate Action Network Canada, this is an existential issue. We need to have a fair transition. Workers and communities need to be the first to benefit from this just transition.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're going to have to wind that up. But we're going to go over to Monsieur Simard. He'll have 2.5 minutes for his round of questions.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Ms. Brouillette, for your comments just now, which puts into perspective some of the erroneous information we have heard to date, and it's food for thought and good for the debate. Now, when it comes to being responsible on the world stage and the gas and oil industry, we're often told about the impacts that this might have on workers. Now, you talked about the just transition earlier. Could you perhaps say a word about the impact on the energy transition on the workers of that sector, please? Well, thank you very much for that question. It's an important one. Canada has a long history of benefiting from natural resource booms and, unfortunately, not planning ahead for the ensuing collapses. For example, commercial fishery in saltwater, what's happened in BC, meat in Quebec. These are just examples of a couple of sectors where there was an abundance of resources in the past which were then exhausted, and the upshot was that the local communities saw their demise because of the economic decline that resulted from that. So evidently, workers from the gas and oil sector are susceptible in this energy transition. This train has left the station given the situation worldwide, but even more than that, a lot of the jobs are becoming automated in these sectors. So it's a golden opportunity today, rather than to be reactive to this transformation, put in place a plan, put workers at the centre of that plan. And there is legislation on a fair, just transition, which has been introduced. And this needs to be done hand in hand with other efforts.
Bon, il me reste pas...
I don't have much time left. I'd just like to come back to an earlier point. I know that there is a rationale that we shouldn't cap production and rather focus on capping emissions. What's your thought on that, please? Well, it's quite straightforward, internationally speaking. Gas and oil companies' production is incompatible with limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So by capping emissions in Canada, if we really want to cut emissions, we need to stop exporting or expanding production domestically.
Mr. Angus, we'll jump right to you for your 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. This is a fascinating discussion. Madame Brouillette, if I heard correctly today from our friends in the oil sector, is that they're not looking at a cap, they're looking to increase production into the global south, where none of what happens is counted as emissions. Does it make sense for the planet that we can sell an extra 1 million barrels a day coming out of TMX, export it to China or India, and whatever happens elsewhere is not going to affect us? Does that in any way seem credible?
So I think you're correct that these are emissions from our exported fuels we don't have to account as per the rules of the Paris Agreement. However, it should not mean that we shouldn't care about these emissions because they're important. The total emissions from our exported fuels are actually larger than all the emissions happening on the territory of what is currently called Canada. And so they're extremely important to consider. And so the cap should consider these emissions, which in jargon we call Scope 3 emissions.
Thank you so much for that. I want to reference an article. I've been referencing articles today, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. I want to go to Forbes magazine. Again, another hotbed of non-radical environmentalism. And January 28th, 2022 article, Madame Brouillette, I would like to get your thoughts on this. They say that what big oil is doing now is running the big tobacco playbook of shifting markets to the global south. And they're saying big oil is running the same play as big tobacco because big oil, like big tobacco, has lost the scientific and public opinion battle in the West, but not for a lack of investment in disinformation and lobbying. So big oil's tobacco-inspired strategy is to first double down on sales abroad, secondly, greenwash at home, thirdly, give big buybacks for shareholders. And finally, big oil will invest just enough in clean energy companies to deflect criticism and ensure that none turn into real competitors. How do you think, is this fair that Forbes is calling the oil sector in Canada similar to what the strategy of Philip Morris and Rothman cigarettes and big tobacco?
It certainly is an interesting comparison. And I think what I'd like to point towards is that there's a narrative in Canada that what is good for the oil and gas industry is good for Canadian workers. And a close examination of the facts shows otherwise. When oil prices crash, oil companies are slash production and thus jobs reduce. And now we're seeing a record oil price, but we're not seeing new employment because what companies do in those circumstances is increase shares and profits to shareholders and invest in new equipment, in existing projects and automation rather than create more employment. And that's why it's essential that we plan a just transition.
Great. We're out of time on that. We're going to go to Mr. Malio for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for joining us today and taking part in this important study. Mr. McMillan, I'd like to go to you first. Based off of what I've heard today, I think you would agree with this, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'm curious to get your thoughts. In both of the previous panels we've had, both meetings we've had so far in this study, we have heard from each that this cap should be a cap on emissions and not a cap on production, obviously ensuring that we're keeping our economy going, keeping our economy strong, providing good jobs. Just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that is the important principle, that it will then enable industry to work on technologies. It will ensure that we're working towards the outcome that I think enables the social benefits as well as the environmental.
And I'll come back to you again. I believe in CAP's submission to the Net Zero Advisory Body. It was Patrick McDonald, I believe, wrote that the pressure on the government to do more to reach net zero can result in innovative approaches being, quote, unintentionally undercut. I'm just wondering if you could provide a bit more context onto what you mean by that.
You know, consistent with my comments earlier, that if we take a very parochial view and limit investment or dissuade investment in Canadian resources, in Canadian technology development, and those investments go to Kazakhstan and Venezuela and Nigeria and Russia, we're going to have global increases in emissions, not decreases. So, you know, being very thoughtful about our climate and energy policy will get us the ultimate outcome we're looking for.
Thank you. I'll ask one more to you, but if anyone else wants to jump in as well, I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts on this. You know, obviously there's a number of suggestions on how best to work with industry on this, and whether it's in terms of investment, in terms of regulation and partnerships. I'm just curious if you can expand a bit more on how you feel the government can best incentivize technological innovations with industries.
You know, a study came out last year that the oil and gas sector invests, I think it was between 50 or 75 cents of every dollar in research and development in Canada. I think harnessing that, incentivizing institutions, universities to partner with the private sector, not just oil and gas, but all private sector, is something that the federal government can do. And I think it's always important to link the provinces in, that provinces are the main regulator for the energy sector and many of the other sectors in Canada, and tapping into their capacity to reach into civil society is going to be an important piece of that as well.
Thank you. Mr. Goodman, I see you unmuted. Did you want to add there?
I'll just add, I mean, short term, you're looking at, to really get to your next set of real reductions, you're looking at CCUS across this country. You're looking at exporting natural gas using Article 6 under Paris, and you're looking at further methane reductions, all of which actually the federal government is, I think, rightly pursuing right now and have some pretty smart policies in place to do that. Longer term, you're obviously looking at incentivizing in some way hydrogen and other aspects associated with that. Thank you.
Okay, I know I have a bit of time left. Did any other witnesses want to comment on that question?
It's Susanna. I'll just make one final comment. I think focusing on where the demand is coming from, again, we are producers of energy. If customers can demand, and if they have technologies to consume lower carbon energy, again, hydrogen trucks as an example, or sustainable aviation fuels that can be consumed by aircraft, that also helps, because this is an end-to-end conversation. It is about supply, it is about demand, it is about distribution. So looking across each part of that value chain to help accelerate the absorption of lower carbon energy.
Okay, I appreciate that. You know, I obviously have a lot of questions here, but running out of time, unfortunately. So I just want to thank you all the witnesses, for contributing today, and I know that your testimony is going to help us greatly as we move forward with the study. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Shahal, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for joining us today. I represent Calgary Skyview here in Northeast Calgary, and thinking about all the workers in the industrial heartland, in all the manufacturers in Nisku and the Duke, and the folks here in East Calgary, top of mind for me is the transformation of being a leader for Canada and Alberta for all things energy. So the workers are top of mind and focus for me. You know, and I think everybody had some great comments today, but I want to start with Mr. Schultz. Mr. Schultz, in your comments, you touched on workers and unnecessary job losses and the risk of that. What else do you think the government can do, and how else do you think the government can support the energy transition and support workers? As you said, your organization has thousands of workers drilling and on service rigs. So can you shed some light on what you think the government should be doing to support workers in the energy transition?
Yeah, great. Mr. Shahal, thanks so much for that question. I think one of the things that needs to be pointed out is the government can support the transition by supporting the energy sector, in particular, the service sector that's predominantly working in the oil and gas industry. And I'll give you a couple examples. Today, we are drilling for geothermal with current oil and gas drilling techniques and technology. We're drilling for lithium in southern Alberta, lithium that's going to go into creating supply chains for battery technology. We're drilling for helium, although not necessarily a pure energy source, but certainly a diversified mix using existing technology that we would deploy on a conventional oil and gas well. And then finally, we're going to be at the forefront of carbon capture and storage, drilling most of the storage caverns that are going to be used by our customers to inject carbon dioxide. So although these are new industries that are starting to form, they only make up about 5% of our overall operations today. 95% still our operations exist in the oil and gas industry. So the transition's coming. The issue is making sure that we do it in a very thoughtful way that allows us to pivot properly without harming existing companies and businesses that are also going to be at the forefront and using similar skill sets of workers that are going to be supporting these new industries.
Thank you for that and highlighting those specific opportunities. Mr. Goodman, you talked a lot about, and I appreciated the principles and the policy framework conversation as we're talking about an emissions cap for the oil and gas sector. That's what our focus is on here today. What's missing from the existing policy framework that we've discussed? What should we be doing to enhance the policy framework moving forward here in Canada?
So thank you very much. I appreciate that question. The reality is that there are a number of key frameworks, particularly for the oil and gas business, from the clean fuel standards to the carbon pricing environment to methane reductions that are driving behavior and still remaining competitive at this point in time within our domestic and foreign exports. The fact of the matter is, what needs to, I think, happen is we need to actually make sure we understand how are those systems linking together, because they're all going to start to sort of combine. And what we're really looking for, again, the number one thing we're looking for here is predictability. Because what investors require, what companies need is they need to know if they put money into this, there is going to be opportunities that will remain in place for the X number of years that are being indicated. Because that's how a business works. No one puts money into something that they're not sure where that will end up. I think the reality is investors are also driving the conversation. As Susanna will know, investors are making some pretty significant demands that align with many of the provincial and federal policies. But again, it is about that predictability. So understanding practically how do you run those policies through effectively a calculator, to be honest. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I hope you make a submission to give us more ideas. Ms. Pierce, since he alluded to you, I want to hear from you. on technology and innovation, what are some of the lowest and cost-effective opportunities to reduce emissions? The lowest cost and lowest risk, and the highest cost and highest risk. What do you see where the opportunities are and what we should avoid?
It's a great question. I think from the lowest cost is obviously what you can do to avoid emissions. In other words, what can you do to make sure that you're operating as efficiently as possible? And so that's one of the things that we in business constantly do is we look at where are we being inefficient because that adds costs. From a higher cost perspective, I think it comes right down to what is the cost of an abatement opportunity based on the carbon price? And I think as Tristan was saying, based on the uncertainty associated with that carbon price or any of the other existing regulations, because you're taking a risk. So for a major project, so for a project in which you're hoping to capture a lot of emissions, if you don't have confidence that the carbon price will be where it's at, or that the clean fuels regulation will be able to generate the credits, you're taking on risk and you're taking on investor risk. And investor risk is just like you and me. We give money to a company and we hope on a return. We buy a house, we hope that that investment in that house doesn't go down, it stays equal, or at least it goes up. So we have to be thoughtful about the investment decisions that we make. Where there's uncertainty, there's risk. And therefore, how we can address some of these big opportunities to capture emissions, as an example, is working with government, with existing regulations, and finding ways to reduce that risk by looking at things that could make that investment economic where it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we're out of time. We're going to now go to Mr. Workington, who will have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I think it's important for us to remind ourselves as politicians that politicians around the world react the same way to the demands of their constituents. And I think that what we have seen over the last number of months, especially with the colder temperatures and the rest, is that our constituents are demanding reliable and affordable forms of energy. And we do know that those who are negatively impacted by high costs when it comes to energy are those who are living in northern communities, rural communities, and often are vulnerable populations, as it is the case in my constituency with seniors and First Nations and others who have called my office talking about their increase, the unbelievably high cost of their energy. And so politicians around the world are looking for reliable and affordable forms of energy. We've heard of from some of my colleagues about their hope that there would be a cap on production here in Canada. And so I think we have to answer a couple of questions. The first one would be, and I think that we have some evidence about what other countries are doing. If not oil and gas, then what? I guess, from the evidence that some of you have testified about, I'd be interested in what your findings have been, where countries are not able to get a reliable source of energy in the form of oil and gas. What are they turning to these days? So, maybe Tim McMillan, if you want to start out with that.
Sure. No, thank you for the question. And I appreciate that global perspective because this truly is a global marketplace. We are seeing, as everyone is, that wind and solar are becoming more cost effective, that the IEA expects them to continue to grow to about 6% of global primary energy demand by 2040. So they are going to expand their role. Nuclear is something that I think people are always looking to into the future, even though it's tough to get them off the ground at any given time. I think that we're seeing a substantial sea shift in how they move energy, the traditional energy, with LNG. LNG was a relatively minor product a decade ago. Today it's meaningful, and a decade from now it'll be even more so. I think the unfortunate answer to your question, though, is where there are constraints and where oil and gas are not readily available, it is coal. And it has been a very difficult fuel to dislodge. Natural gas has done a good job of it in a few countries, Canada, the US, and Europe. But in the developing world, it is an incredibly durable fuel and hard to displace.
That seems to be the evidence that I've seen as well, is that many countries that have looked for reliable and cost-effective forms of energy have certainly turned to coal. We see that in Europe and Asia, as some of you testified earlier. I guess the next question is if oil and gas continue to be also part of that mix, and if Canada cannot supply the growing demand, we know that the world continues to be hungry for energy. if not Canada. I think we've referenced the fact that it's going to come from other places, but let's go into that. Like where are countries, what are we talking about when we're talking about, I think even the general population doesn't know who we're talking about when we say OPEC. They don't know who we're talking about in terms of alternative sources of oil and gas.
When you look at the global top 10 producers for oil and gas, it is a group that Canada and the US are part of. But beyond those two democratic nations, it is Russia, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela. Norway no longer even reaches into the top 10, nor does the UK North Sea. So, when you look at where that major supply comes from, Canada and the US are the most democratic members. After that, it gets to regimes that certainly don't share the values of most Canadians.
In terms of if we're looking purely to test the concerns about the environment, let's set aside the human rights records, let's set aside the governance records of those countries, but we just simply look at the environmental record of those countries. What are we looking at in terms of comparisons between ourselves? Obviously, we're an importer of oil and gas, unfortunately, and the US for certain is. So let's look at the other countries.
Truly across the board differences that a country like Venezuela has a very high emissions profile for their production. Someone like Saudi Arabia has a relatively low, we think, for a lot of their production, although Saudi Arabia has a heavy oil that they export as well. So it truly is across the board. When you look at someone like Russia, we have done so much work on venting and flaring. We have got our methane emissions down to just minuscule amounts. Countries, the rest of those countries probably aren't even monitoring it. They don't have the regulatory structure we do. It is something where I think our expertise truly could be helpful. And I think we probably need to continue to push what we know broadly.
And this, I guess, is my concern, is that if we
in
Canada...
We're out of time there, Mr. Workington.
I apologize. Thank you.
It goes quickly, and I just want to make sure we get through the last three. So we're going to jump to Mr. Maloney, who has 5 minutes, and then we'll finish up with Monsieur Simard and Mr. Angus for 2.5 minutes each.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Okay, I'll try to be quick. Mr. McMillan, I'm going to start with you. Thank you for being here. It's always good to see you. I have a straightforward question to start out with, at least I think it is. I am not clear. Are you in favor of a cap or not?
I think we would like to know what the government's intent is with the cap. At this point, our intent is to work to have an efficient regulatory system that lowers emissions and puts the right incentives to drive investment and emission reductions.
Okay, I get that, but you didn't answer my question. So the answer is no. Is that fair?
I won't give you a blanket answer until I know the depth behind what's intended with this cap.
Okay, so based on that answer, I will interpret it as meaning that there is a scenario in which you could live with there being a cap. It's just not the current environment right now. Is that fair?
If it enables Canada to play a role in lowering global emissions, then I think that scenario would be broadly supported.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. You had mentioned earlier that Canada can play a large global role in technology. Responsibly produced Canadian energy can play a role internationally. But you keep going back to coal. Wouldn't you agree with me that nuclear energy has played a big role in that scenario as well?
I think it would be great if nuclear would play a larger role. Obviously not in my mandate, but if it can take a bigger toehold, it certainly meets some of the criteria that we're looking for.
Okay, great. So we can agree on that, because I live in Ontario, and the reason we don't have smog days in Toronto anymore is because of nuclear energy, not because of wind or solar, and we got off coal only because of our ability to transfer to nuclear energy. There's all kinds of nuclear power that's being developed now, which can do exactly what you're doing. So my point is simply this: I don't think it's fair to characterize a cap leading to coal, because there are other alternatives. Would you agree with that?
I guess it comes down to the time frame, and that I would say that there's no silver bullet, and coal is going to be part of it, but I think that displacing coal with natural gas is probably the most immediate thing we could do.
Mr. McMillan, I understand who you represent, and I want to say thank you to your entire industry because without you, our economy would be in very, very difficult shape. And as we've discussed earlier today, this is not, the enemy is emissions, not production. So I want you to understand where I'm coming from. In fact, I think you knew that already. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to Mr. Goodman. Mr. Goodman, thank you for your 6 points and sort of picking up on what Mr. McMillan was saying. Your first point was you said use existing climate policy frameworks. I'm not quite sure what you mean on that. Does that mean let's stay where we are and let's not add any new layers of policy that are going to complicate things? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, that's actually not what I'm trying to say. I mean, the reality is you may need to introduce new policy, and the democratically elected government obviously has every right to do that, and we'll work with whatever policy is put in place. What I'm trying to get at there is there are some existing frameworks. Probably the biggest one here is, well, there's two, methane and carbon pricing, which do seem to be, they're being absorbed within our industry. They're being absorbed by other industries and Canadians. And we see how to work within that framework. There are some constructive positives there that we can look to, and where we can build on that under those existing policies, that's useful. What we're looking for is what happens, for example, to a clean tech industry, an emerging clean tech industry that many of our members are involved in and investing in. Does all of a sudden does that get negatively impacted in any way? And I'm not suggesting it does, but you would want to know that.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. So I will take it then you will agree with what Ms. Pierce said earlier. She's supportive of the fuel charge, the clean fuel standard, and the output-based charges that are in place now.
I'm always cautious to agree with Ms. Pierce, but no. The reality is that yes, we generally would agree with that.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm certainly not trying to pit
thank you
against one another because we're all in this together. We all want the same thing. We're just taking a slightly different route sometimes. Last question, and this is something Ms. Pierce said, and I don't have much time here, but you said if we don't do it now, it's going to be harder to do later and more complicated to do later. So, Mr. Goodman, Mr. McMillan, would you agree with that statement? And doesn't a cap fit into doing it now to avoid making it harder later?
Say we're at the end of time, but yeah, just really quickly, please.
Yeah, I'll go first very quickly. I certainly think it's easier to do now than later. I mean, we're yet to examine the cap, but we look forward to doing that, and I hope some of the points we put forward are constructive in examining that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to Mr. Mard, who has 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I'd just like to come back to Mr. Joseph and Mr. McMillan. This week, Professor Jacquard told us that cutting emissions in the oil sector couldn't occur without the support of the state. And you're fully aware that the Environment Minister announced an end to fossil fuel subsidies by 2023. So you have a very small window available to you. You referred to predictability. So I can't see how your sector will be able to cut its emissions in that time frame. But I'd like to turn to another issue. I'd like to debunk a myth, that is that gas is a adequate replacement for coal. I come from Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, and there was a project that was not allowed to go forward. According to BAP, gas is not a replacement energy. It is an additional energy, and according to the law of the market, there is more supply. The more the supply there is in the energy sector, the less demand there is. So, Ms. Brouillette, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Well, thank you for your question. And liquefied gas production is interesting here. We take into account the leaks that are often numerous, and it's not often more advantageous than coal. And indeed, the BAP, which is the consultative body in Quebec, rejected the project on that basis. They said that this project will not, in fact, reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally speaking. So that does call into question a number of the points that we've heard this evening. Indeed, it does. Well, since I have a little bit of time left, could you please respond to Mr. Goodman on this whole notion of predictability? How do you see the end of subsidies to fossil fuels by 2023? How will that play out? Did you hear me, Ms. Bruyette? Or Mr. Goodman, rather. Perhaps Mr. McMillan would like to respond. How do you see the end of subsidies to fossil fuels by 2023? How do you see that playing out?
So as far as in Canada, in some countries there are subsidies for oil and gas. In Canada, we are net contributors to provinces, municipalities, and the federal government. There are some initiatives that the federal government is trying to initiate that is for all industries, carbon capture and storage being one of them. And I know that cement, fertilizer, oil and gas, and manufacturing are all looking at an economic model that would work for multiple industries.
Thank you. We're going to go for our last 2.5 minutes. I realize that we're just slightly past the time we had asked. I hope everybody will indulge us for the last 2.5 minutes. I'll need less than a minute to wrap things up, and we will have you on our way. So, Mr. Angus, over to you for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair, once again for your long-suffering patience in keeping this motley crew of ours all moving forward. So I'm going to close now. Mr. McMillan, I was reading your March 27th, 2020 letter to the Minister of Natural Resources that was CC'd to pretty much everyone in Cabinet. And it was a pretty audacious wish list of regulations and exemptions and protections and obligations you wanted to be exempt from. But one of the things that struck me most was your request not to have to report to the lobbying registry. Why?
So, Mr. Angus, obviously March 2020 was at the height of the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. It was a time where all of Canadians were stopping going to their offices. They were trying to avoid work. We were putting forward to governments a model that we thought would enable us to continue to produce natural gas and oil
I get
for
that.
the
It's just
Canadian customers and getting it shipped out. As far as
but the lobbying registry, the issue here is that this is a law of the nation. This isn't a regulation. This is a law, and the law was put in to ensure accountability and prevent corruption. And yet you guys wanted to be able to go off the grid on this. And I could see why. I mean, God, you clocked 3 contacts a day, 222 meetings, 220 meetings. That's staggering. Now, I get that was the first year of the pandemic, but this past year, you had 17 meetings with the Minister of Environment or his staff, 25 meetings with the Minister of Natural Resources or staff. In addition, Imperial Oil, 17 meetings, Suncor, 25 meetings, Exxon and Canada Natural Resources, 12 meetings. I'm counting about a meeting every 3 days through the year. The reason we have the lobbying registry is so we know how much access the insider passes that you guys have. That's pretty extraordinary. Don't you think the fact that you could keep your oil production going, you could still respect the law of the country and report all these massive amounts of meetings with key ministers?
Yeah, and Mr. Angus, just for clarity again, I think that it's important that we recognize what we were looking for was some flexibility on when we report, that this was a time where people were stopping going to the office, that the workforce that would be submitting that from our side, but also receiving it from the government were probably not in their offices. And I would expect you would know that it was very difficult
But you were the only guys asking that. That's what concerns me. You're the only of the industries. You had massive amount of access that I didn't see. I mean, you guys weren't doing vaccines, you weren't doing PPE, but you had, a meeting every 3 days, and yet you were the only ones asking not to have to report it. I just find that surprising.
Yeah, no, obviously the government was very keen to ensure that the energy supply would continue, as we were still at a time of year where that's very important to Canadians. And we were looking at how we could do that safely.
and working with responsible parties to do that.
With that, folks,
so much. Thank you.
we're at the end of our time today. I do want to, first of all, thank the witnesses for being here. We've had some great conversations. I apologize that we were a bit late getting started. I don't know if it was explained that the members were in the House at a vote, and so we got here as quickly as possible. But I really appreciate everyone making time to be part of of the important conversation that we're having today. And for the members, our next meeting will be Monday, February 14th. We'll continue our study. We have 6 witnesses appearing. The notice of meeting will be posted shortly. For the witnesses who are with us today, if you have anything further that you would like to contribute, you can send to our clerk up to a 10-page brief. And so feel free if you have further things to add that you think would be of use to the study. And with that, folks, meeting is adjourned. We'll see you next week.